Usually when we talk about experiencing a teenage heartbreak, there's there's this really heavy expectation of triviality. Like it gets framed as just a passing storm.
No, absolutely. Like it's just this biological cliche you have to survive.
You cry over a boy who doesn't look at you, you write his name in a spiral notebook, and the adults around you just point and say, youth, she'll get over it.
Yeah, it's treated as a developmental phase,
Yeah,
essentially. Like, just wait until you reach the shores of rational adulthood and you'll be fine.
exactly. But then if you step into the world of actual visceral emotional
Mm.
memory, like if you stop and really remember what that felt like, that tidy categorization completely falls apart.
It really does.
Uh,
The sheer, unadulterated weight of it is staggering.
It is. We're looking at a landscape of longing that isn't just dramatic. It is the absolute definition of an existential crisis, merely disguised as a high school crush, which is exactly the premise of a bizarre, brilliant, and totally anonymous new book we are jumping into today.
I am so excited for this.
Same. It's called Teardrops. On my guitar dash, Schopenhauer meets Taylor Swift.
And welcome to today's deep dive, by the way. I'm so thrilled to have you here to unpack this with me.
It is a genuinely remarkable text to dive into, not least because of its authorship.
Oh, right. The author is completely elusive.
Yeah, it's written under a pseudonym. The characters translate from Taiwanese Mandarin to mouse-colored cat.
Mouse-colored cat. I love that so much.
Right. And we know very little about who actually wrote this, except for a few rumors. Some suggest they might be a former programmer turned lawyer, or maybe a philosopher who just prefers to think in silence somewhere between Brussels, Antwerp, and Krakow.
Which is such a specific set of cities.
It is, but the author waves all of that away in the preface, calling it a geographical misunderstanding.
They also note in that preface that they dislike lukewarm water, predictable arguments, and cats without ambition, and they claim everything else is just camouflage.
It's a great setup. It really is. I appreciate an author who leads with that kind of defensive irony, especially given the mission of this book. Because we are exploring a truly radical premise today.
We really are.
This ambitious cat is asking a question that seems, frankly, absurd on its face. What if the questions compressed into a 3.5-minute pop song are the exact same existential dilemmas that have haunted university libraries for 25 centuries? Have you ever felt like your teenage heartbreak was actually a profound metaphysical crisis?
I mean, haven't we all? But we should probably clarify the boundaries of what we're doing here today.
Good idea. Lay it out for us.
This isn't a standard biography of Arthur Schopenhauer just tracing his life in 19th century Germany, nor is it like a retrospective review of Taylor Swift's debut album.
Right, it's not a music review.
Exactly. The book's project is to smash them together. We're putting the ultimate philosopher of pessimism and a global pop icon in the exact same room.
Which sounds insane.
It does, but it's to reveal the underlying architecture of human desire, the inevitability of suffering, and, believe it or not, by the end of this, the future of artificial intelligence.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because I know a segment of our audience just rolled their eyes. I mean, Taylor Swift and Schopenhauer. The author actually knows it too, right?
Oh, they are fully aware. They explicitly state that this is not an attempt to prove Taylor Swift is a philosopher.
Right. They say trying to prove she's a philosopher would be tedious and, what was the phrase, false in the wrong way?
False in the wrong way, yeah. The author isn't trying to elevate pop music by dressing it up in academic robes. Instead, they want to interrogate the eye roll itself.
To smirk.
Exactly. Why does pairing Taylor Swift with Arthur Schopenhauer feel like a punchline to some people? Before we even look at the lyrics or the metaphysics, we have to dismantle that skepticism.
And to do that, the author brings in Pierre Bourdieu's sociological masterpiece, Distinction, which I found so fascinating.
It is such a crucial lens for this. Bourdieu fundamentally changes how we view our own tastes.
Right. I always understood distinction to mean that our preferences, like whether we prefer a dense 500-page philosophical treatise or a stadium pop anthem, are not objective measures of our intellectual depth.
No, not at all. They are tools.
Tools we use for social sorting, right?
That is the core of Bourdieu's argument, yeah. He suggests that what we categorize as high culture versus low culture is entirely about the accumulation of cultural capital.
Okay, so break that down for us.
Well, let's look at how these products circulate. A philosophical text circulates with academic credentials, peer review, and a really high barrier to entry.
You have to know the jargon to even read it.
Exactly. But a pop song circulates on Spotify playlists and top 40 radio. The traditional elite view is that pop culture is inherently shallow simply because it's accessible.
Because everyone can get it.
Right. Bourdieu points out that pop culture is suspect to the elite merely because it spreads too widely.
So the scarcity is the point. The book frames this brilliantly, I think. If 70,000 people in a brightly lit stadium understand a piece of art and scream the lyrics back at the stage,
It's incredible.
that art can no longer be used as a status signal to elevate the elite. Like, if everyone gets it, you don't get to feel special for getting it.
You lose that exclusivity. It loses its function as a gatekeeping mechanism completely.
And that is the defense the author builds here, isn't it?
It is. The argument is that the questions being asked in these massive stadium shows, questions about identity, the imbalance of power in relationships, the illusion of freedom, are the exact same inquiries that preoccupied people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Hannah Arendt, Friedrich Nietzsche.
That's wild to think about.
It is, but the only difference is the delivery system.
Yeah.
When a pop star asks them, she asks them in 3.5 minutes, and she does it without asking for permission from the Academy.
And that lack of permission is what really gets under the skin of the academic establishment. Right?
Oh, totally.
The book illustrates this beautifully in a section called Taylor's Way - Apocryphal. Now, the author clearly states this was not written by Swift herself. It's this imaginary 2 a.m. diary entry.
Crafted just to create a dialogue between the pop work and the philosophical tradition.
Yeah, and the imaginary Taylor in this text writes about sitting on the floor in pajamas, scribbling secrets in spiral notebooks, and trying to understand why time behaves so strangely.
Like why it accelerates when you're in love.
Exactly, and why it stops dead when your heart is broken. The text leans really heavily into the gendered aspect of this dismissal, too.
It does. The imaginary diary notes how her feelings were constantly policed, people telling her she was too much, too loud, too frequent, and fundamentally just too feminine to be taken seriously.
As if adolescence isn't the precise moment in human development when you feel the world with, like, the violence of a summer storm.
Exactly. The specific questions posed in this imaginary diary are stunning, honestly.
I'll read a few of them. I love that part.
It asks why the memory of a scarf left in a drawer weighs more heavily on the mind than an entire decade of normal life. Yeah. It asks if we are ultimately defined by those who love us, or by the negative space left by those who leave us. The text suggests that maybe she wasn't just writing about a boy with blue eyes.
Maybe she was unknowingly debating with Plato about the nature of illusion.
Or arguing with Jean-Paul Sartre about how the gaze of the other strips us of our autonomy.
It just elevates the totally mundane details of a breakup into these massive ontological questions. And then it ends with this fantastic, super nerdy joke.
Oh, about Kant, yes.
Right. Apparently Kant loved the bridge in Cruel Summer. I love that line so much.
Yeah.
But we should probably explain why that's funny, because it actually tells us a lot about what this book is trying to do.
Yeah, we should. So Immanuel Kant wrote extensively about the concept of the sublime.
In his critique of judgment, right?
Correct. For Kant, the beautiful is something pleasant and bounded. A nice painting, a pretty melody, you look at it and feel good.
Safe.
Exactly, safe. But the sublime is something else entirely. It is an experience of overwhelming, almost terrifying magnitude or power.
Like standing at the edge of a massive raging waterfall.
Or looking up at a towering, jagged mountain peak. It threatens to completely obliterate your senses. But in that moment of sensory overload, your rational mind realizes it can still comprehend the concept of the infinite.
So you realize your own cognitive power in the face of nature's fury.
Exactly. You feel tiny, but your mind spans the universe.
So by joking that Kant loved the bridge in Cruel Summer, the author is basically saying that a massive, screaming pop music bridge, where the synths swell, the vocals hit the top of the register, and 70,000 people lose their minds simultaneously, is a modern sonic equivalent of the Kantian sublime.
It is a sensory avalanche. It completely overloads the senses.
It really does. But you can see how an academic might find this entire exercise super irritating.
Oh, definitely. And the author anticipates this pushback. They write directly to the Academy, acknowledging that they are compressing major philosophical concepts into just a few pages,
Stripping out the jargon.
removing the footnotes completely. The text dryly admits, "We have seen traditions treated with greater reverence."
The Academy does love its reverence. But wait. If a pop song is just acting as a philosophical thesis without asking permission, does that mean clarity is actually treated as a betrayal in academia?
It really is sometimes. If you can explain the human condition in a 3-minute song, does that threaten the industry of 500-page dissertations?
That's a great point.
The author fiercely defends the removal of that academic armor. They write, "To simplify is to flatten. To translate is to risk. And risk, unlike prestige, is democratic."
I mean, that is such a compelling argument. Risk is democratic.
It really reframes the whole endeavor. The argument here is that translating a complex philosopher into a lucid, accessible format or pairing them with a pop star isn't a degradation of the philosophy.
It's actually being faithful to it.
Yes, it is an act of fidelity to the actual ideas. The goal is to prove that loving popular culture and engaging deeply with philosophy are not mutually exclusive states of being.
So with the academic gatekeepers completely bypassed and the smirk wiped off our faces, we can actually get into the core of the argument here.
Let's do it.
To understand how a song about a high school crush relates to the profound architecture of human suffering, we have to look at the architect of pessimism himself.
We have to meet Arthur Schopenhauer.
Yes. Let's talk about this guy. We need to explore the biography of a man who looked at the universe and concluded that it was fundamentally, inescapably hostile.
And honestly, if you look at his life, you can kind of see how he got there.
Oh, absolutely. He was born in 1788 in Danzig.
Mm.
And materially, his family was incredibly wealthy. They were rich merchants.
But emotionally, it was a profound disaster.
A total nightmare. When Arthur was a young man, his father was found dead in a canal. And it was widely understood to be a suicide.
Which is a catastrophic psychological trauma that undoubtedly shaped his belief that human existence is fundamentally defined by pain.
It has to have. But the dynamic with his mother is even more telling, I think.
Oh, Johanna Schopenhauer.
Yeah. She's a famous author in her own right, and she essentially abandoned any traditional maternal role to host literary salons in Weimar.
She was throwing these massive parties with Goethe and the intellectual elite of Germany.
And she found her son, Arthur, to be completely insufferable.
Mm-hmm.
She literally told him that his gloomy presence ruined her parties.
Talk about Mother of the Year.
Right. So you have this brilliant, deeply neglected young man who looks at the social climbing and optimism of Weimar society. And he basically decides that anyone who claims life is joyful is just participating in a massive collective lie.
And that personal alienation crystallized into his magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, which was published in 1818.
Okay, reading through the text, I was really trying to conceptualize what Schopenhauer meant by the will, because it's such a nebulous term.
It can be tricky to pin down.
The closest modern analogy I could come up with is that it feels like an operating system running in the background of a computer.
Oh, I like that.
Like, the OS doesn't care if you open a spreadsheet, play a video game, or write a love letter. It has no moral compass and no end goal. Its only function is to relentlessly consume battery power and keep the machine running. Is that how Schopenhauer saw human drive?
That is a highly effective analogy. Schopenhauer diagnosed reality by arguing that beneath everything we see, beneath our conscious choices, our intellect, the physical world, there's a blind, irrational, and relentless force.
And he called that the will to life.
Right. Or simply the will.
Mm-hmm.
It is the operating system, exactly as you say. It drives the salmon to swim upstream, it drives the ivy to climb the wall, and it drives humans to desire endlessly.
But if it's just a neutral operating system, why does he associate it so heavily with suffering?
Because of the paradox it creates within conscious beings. The will compels us to want things, to desire.
Right.
But what is desire? Fundamentally, it is the pain of lacking something. If you do not have food, you feel hunger. That is suffering.
And if you don't have love, you feel loneliness, which is also suffering.
Exactly. So we are driven by the pain of deprivation to seek an object.
But what happens when you get the object? I mean, if I'm starving and I finally eat, the suffering stops, doesn't it?
Briefly. Very briefly, this is where Schopenhauer's pessimism becomes absolute.
Yeah.
If you actually attain the object of your desire, the will doesn't shut off. It simply recognizes that the lack is gone. And in the absence of the struggle to attain something, you are plunged into boredom.
Oh, wow. So the satisfaction is entirely fleeting.
Completely. So life, in his view, is an endless oscillation. We swing back and forth like a pendulum between the pain of wanting something and the profound, empty boredom of having it.
Which means there is no winning state.
None. The machine is broken by design.
It promises fulfillment, but only delivers temporary relief before finding a completely new target to desire. That is so bleak.
It is bleak. And this is exactly why he was so vehemently opposed to the prevailing philosophy of his day.
Which brings us to his legendary academic rivalry. The book highlights this, and it is hilarious.
It really is a great story.
So Schopenhauer gets a teaching position at the University of Berlin in the 1820s. And the absolute undisputed rock star of philosophy at that time is Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
Hegel was the titan of German idealism. His philosophy was the complete antithesis of Schopenhauer's.
How so?
Hegel believed in teleology, the idea that history is a rational process moving toward a specific positive destination.
Progress, basically.
Right. He believed in the progression of human freedom, the development of the state, and that the universe was essentially an unfolding of rational thought. It was deeply optimistic and highly flattering to human intelligence.
Which Schopenhauer found utterly repulsive.
Absolutely sickening.
He saw history not as a rational progression, but as a blind, churning mechanism going literally nowhere. So what does Schopenhauer do?
This is my favorite part.
Out of sheer spite and an incredibly inflated sense of his own genius, he deliberately schedules his lectures at the exact same time as Hegel's lectures.
Pure academic pettiness.
He is convinced that the students of Berlin will abandon Hegel's optimistic nonsense and flock to hear his truth about the miserable reality of the will.
It was an audacious move.
And a catastrophic failure.
Yeah.
Nobody showed up.
Not a soul.
Hegel's lecture hall was packed, and Schopenhauer was speaking to an empty room. He's essentially laughed out of academia.
And he spent the next few decades living in the shadows, bitter, brilliant, and completely isolated.
Well, almost completely. He opted out of human society and decided to live exclusively with his poodles.
The recurring poodles, yes.
He would successively name his poodles Atma, which is a Sanskrit word meaning the inner self or the soul of the world.
Such a philosopher thing to name a dog.
Right. And the book points out that he vastly preferred the company of dogs because, as he saw it, human affection was always transactional. It was always driven by the will.
But dogs don't pretend.
Exactly. Dogs don't engage in the hypocritical theater of human relationships. So Schopenhauer is basically the 19th century equivalent of the ultimate anti-influencer.
I love that comparison.
Like, he's a guy who realized the algorithm of life is rigged to make us miserable, so he just logged off, unplugged the router, and hung out with his dog.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's fascinating historically. For 2,000 years, Western philosophy, from Aristotle's virtue ethics to the Christian theologians, generally promised that happiness or salvation was achievable.
You just had to follow the right path.
Right, whether that was reason, faith, or civic duty. Schopenhauer was the first major Western philosopher to explicitly look at the machinery of existence and declare, no, happiness is structurally impossible.
Man. And that profound pessimism is exactly the framework the author uses to analyze Taylor Swift's debut era. Specifically, the song Teardrops on My Guitar.
It is the perfect test case.
So let's map this out. How does a grand, universe-standing theory about the will map onto a teenage girl crying over a boy named Drew?
It maps perfectly because unrequited love is the ultimate, purest manifestation of Schopenhauer's theory. It is a mathematical proof by contradiction.
Okay, the setup of the song is pretty straightforward. The narrator is deeply in love with Drew. Drew is completely oblivious, and in fact, he is talking to the narrator about another girl he has a crush on.
Brutal.
The narrator just has to sit there, smile, and listen to it, while internally completely falling apart.
The book refers to this as the metaphysics of emptiness.
Oh, that's a heavy phrase.
Right. The subject desires something, Drew's affection, but the object of desire is structurally unavailable. The world moves on with complete indifference to her internal agony. To want is always to lose.
To really drive this home, the author includes a section called The Letter from Philosopher.
This was brilliant.
It's this piece of creative nonfiction where they imagine Schopenhauer writing a letter directly to a Swiftie to explain the mechanics of her heartbreak.
And in this letter, Schopenhauer addresses the fundamental illusion of unrequited love. He tells the listener, you believe your suffering comes from him. You believe it is his indifference, his blindness, his physical absence that is causing your pain.
Which is exactly how we process heartbreak. We always externalize it. We blame the object. We think, if only Drew would turn around and look at me, the pain would stop, and I would be happy.
But Schopenhauer delivers the philosophical correction. He says, you are mistaken. Your suffering does not come from his absence. It comes from the structure of desire itself.
Because we do not desire what we already possess. Desire inherently requires a lack.
Yes, Drew is only irresistible because he escapes her grasp.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let me make sure I'm following the logic here. If Drew is the object, and desire requires a lack of the object, then Drew's indifference isn't the obstacle preventing her happiness.
Not at all.
His indifference is the very thing generating her desire in the first place.
Exactly. If we apply the pendulum analogy from earlier, the letter goes on to explain what would happen if she actually got what she wanted.
And what does he say?
It says, if he did choose you, your suffering would not disappear. It would merely change its form. You would no longer fear losing him. You would eventually begin to tire of him.
Wait, really? Is Schopenhauer basically saying that if she got the guy, her suffering wouldn't disappear, it would just change form?
Yes.
So if she got the guy, she'd just end up writing a song about being bored of him.
Because the will promises an intensity of fulfillment that it is structurally incapable of delivering.
Ugh, that is devastating. The book really drives this dark reality home with a multiple choice question segment settled, who wants to win nothing?
Yes, and it asks the reader to identify the true function of unrequited love in the song.
The incorrect answers offer the standard psychological comforts we usually rely on, right?
They do. They suggest that the unrequited love is just a unique tragic narrative, or a temporary emotional pain that will build character, or simply that desire burns hotter when it's delayed.
But the correct answer, answer D, is terrifying.
Answer D states that desire depends on lack and inherently cannot be satisfied.
And never satisfied.
Never. It reveals that desire isn't oriented toward fulfillment at all. It is oriented solely toward its own perpetuation. The fact that Drew isn't looking at her isn't a problem to be solved. His absence is the necessary condition for the feeling to exist in the first place.
So unrequited love is the will running perfectly on empty. It's burning incredibly hot, it's completely insatiable, and it's entirely indifferent to whether the human experiencing it is miserable.
It is the operating system running at maximum capacity with no applications open.
That is such a good way to put it. But wait, if human existence is just this inescapable trap, if getting what you want leads to boredom and not getting it leads to agony, is there any escape?
That's the big question.
Does Schopenhauer offer a way out? Or does he just leave us trapped in the machine? And does Taylor Swift offer one?
He does offer one loophole. It is a very specific, temporary escape hatch. Art. Specifically, the aesthetic contemplation of art through music.
Let's explore that. He had a whole hierarchy of the arts, didn't he?
He did. He believed that most forms of art like architecture, sculpture, or painting were tied to the physical world. They represent physical objects, so they are still somewhat bound by the will.
Okay, that makes sense.
But music was different. Schopenhauer placed music at the absolute pinnacle of human achievement. He believed that music doesn't represent the physical world. It is a direct copy of the will itself.
Wow.
It speaks to the core of our being without needing to pass through the rational, conceptual brain.
You don't need to logically parse a chord progression to feel a sense of dread or a sense of triumph. It just hits your nervous system directly.
Exactly. But here's the crucial distinction. Music does not cure human suffering. That is impossible. What music does is suspend it.
Suspend it. The book explores this suspension through a scripted dialogue called the dinner conversation, right?
Yes, it pits two archetypes against each other, the snob and the Swiftie. It dramatizes exactly the high versus low culture clash we discussed with Bourdieu.
And the snob takes the totally predictable elite position. They dismiss the song entirely, saying, "Teardrops on My Guitar is literally just about a teenage girl who cries because a boy won't look at her. You don't need Arthur Schopenhauer to decode that. It's trite."
But the Swiftie immediately counters by pointing out that this trait scenario is the exact structure of reality Schopenhauer described. Drew doesn't look at her, and that absence is what makes him a god in her eyes. The Swiftie says, it's not adolescence, it's metaphysics.
The snob gets super defensive, accusing the Swiftie of projecting a massive philosophical framework onto a minor, hormonal high school crush.
Naturally.
But the Swiftie holds their ground. They argue that a 16-year-old girl is describing the exact mechanism of the universe. She knows he won't love her, she continues to want him anyway, and she suffers. The Swiftie concludes, it's the world as will and representation compressed into 3 minutes.
But then the snob brings up what I think is a genuinely fair critique.
Oh, the business argument.
Right. The snob argues that Schopenhauer's goal was to identify desire so we could eventually give it up, an ascetic renunciation. But Taylor Swift is doing the exact opposite.
She is turning desire into a massive commercial enterprise. She's monetizing the suffering.
It's a very strong economic argument. But the Swiftie counters by using Schopenhauer's own loophole of aesthetic contemplation.
Oh, how so?
The Swiftie points out that Taylor doesn't renounce the desire, she transforms it. By turning the raw, agonizing pain of lack into a structured, melodic song, she creates the exact aesthetic way out that Schopenhauer theorized.
Right. The snob says, you can't solve human suffering with an acoustic guitar. And the Swiftie has the perfect response.
You can't solve it at all. That's exactly the point. But you can suspend it for 3 minutes and 40 seconds.
The concept of suspension is the key to understanding the profound value of pop music in this framework. I picture it like a treadmill.
Okay, tell me more.
Like, the will forces you onto this treadmill of desire. You're sprinting, you're exhausted, you're constantly chasing a carrot dangling in front of you, and you're suffering.
You're just exhausted.
But when you put on a song that perfectly articulates that exact pain, it's like hitting the pause button on the treadmill of life. For 3 minutes and 40 seconds, you're not the one running and suffering anymore. You step off the belt. You are just watching the treadmill operate.
What's fascinating here is the monumental scale of that suspension. When 40 million people listen to that song and recognize their own specific isolating pain reflected in the lyrics, it creates a collective moment of grace.
It stops the machinery.
Yes, the relentless machinery of suffering pauses. You transition from being the active subject who desires and hurts into the passive observer who is simply contemplating the beauty of how that suffering is expressed.
It's a remedy, even if it only lasts until the song fades out. But of course, the book doesn't just offer this metaphysical interpretation. It actively shows how differently people can analyze the exact same piece of pop culture.
Right. It introduces two characters who represent the extremes of analysis, the academic and the cynic.
This is where the book allows for a brilliant meta-critique of its own premise. Let's start with the academic, Professor Melick Merriwell.
Professor Merriwell, yes.
I have to admit, as I was reading Merriwell's section, my eyes started to glaze over. He uses the most impenetrable, labyrinthine jargon to describe a simple crush.
Oh, it's incredibly dense.
I actually want to push back on this section. Is Merriwell just a parody of academic bloat? Or is he actually saying something useful? Because when he calls unrequited love a clausula rebus sic stantibus of effective asymmetry, I feel like he's intentionally trying to lose the audience.
He is absolutely a caricature of academic over-intellectualization.
Right.
But if we decode the vocabulary, his points are remarkably sharp.
Okay, let's break that down. What does that phrase even mean?
Clausula rebus sic stantibus is actually a legal doctrine in international law.
Wait, international law?
Yes. It translates roughly to things thus standing. It means that a treaty or contract is only binding as long as the fundamental conditions that existed when it was signed remain the same. If the conditions change radically, the contract is void.
Okay, so how on earth does that apply to Drew and Taylor?
Merriwell is arguing that unrequited love is an emotional contract where the conditions are frozen. Because Drew never engages, the conditions never change. The fantasy is never tested by the mundane reality of an actual relationship. Therefore, the emotional intensity of the contract remains permanently binding.
I see. So because it never becomes real, it can never be ruined by reality. That's actually brilliant.
Right.
Merriwell also uses a phrase I actually loved. He calls the dynamic an Esterian recursive boomerang.
It's a beautifully evocative phrase. He's referencing M.C. Escher, the artist famous for drawing staircases that seem to loop infinitely upward but never actually go anywhere.
So Merriwell is saying that the absence of a return, the fact that Drew gives nothing back, doesn't diminish the singer's feelings.
No, instead that absence feeds back into the loop, increasing her emotional investment. The harder he ignores her, the harder the boomerang comes back to hit her.
And Merriwell grounds this metaphysical loop in modern behavioral psychology, which I found fascinating. He connects Schopenhauer to behavioral psychology by comparing Drew's behavior to intermittent reinforcement.
This is a crucial psychological mechanism. In behavioral psychology, B.F. Skinner discovered that if you reward a rat every single time it presses a lever, it will press the lever when it's hungry and then stop.
Makes sense.
If you never reward it, it stops pressing the lever entirely. But if you reward it intermittently, unpredictably, randomly, the rat will obsessively press the lever until it collapses.
It's the exact psychology of a slot machine.
Yeah.
The unpredictability is what creates the addiction.
Precisely. In the context of the song, Drew might smile at her one day in the hallway and then ignore her for a week. That unpredictability creates a massive dopamine spike when he finally does look at her.
And Merriwell concludes that Drew's indifference is not a bug in the system. It's the engine driving the entire narrative.
Exactly.
Okay, I'll grant that Merriwell has some deep insights hidden under that jargon. But I want to take the side of the cynic here. The book introduces Gaston Blunder, who reads Merriwell's dense theory and basically rolls his eyes.
Blender represents the pragmatic economic critique of pop culture.
Right. Blunder cuts through all the clausula rebus nonsense and says, look, the less he cares, the more she does. We don't need a PhD in metaphysics to understand that.
He is very direct.
Blunder looks at this through the lens of the music industry. He points out what Merriwell and Schopenhauer both ignored. If Drew suddenly fell deeply in love with the narrator, the song wouldn't be a profound exploration of human existence.
It would be a 30-second jingle.
It would be shorter, simpler, and far less lucrative. Blunder strips away the romance and asserts that the suffering isn't a tragic metaphysical trap. It is simply efficient songwriting.
Because narrative tension sells records.
Exactly. Blunder drops this incredible line. Happy people don't write songs. They go out to dinner. And possibly more. But that's none of our business.
That's a great line.
Blunder has a massive point here. Does Blunder have a point here? Are we, and is the author of this book, just projecting high-minded philosophy onto a situation that's ultimately just an efficient business model for songwriting?
Is it Schopenhauer or is it just capitalism?
Exactly.
That is the exact tension the author wants you to feel. The brilliance of the book is that it refuses to declare a winner between Merriwell and Blunder.
It holds both realities in tension.
Yes. The text demonstrates that a single, perfectly crafted pop song is robust enough to simultaneously support Blunder's cynical economic critique and Merriwell's deep ontological psychological framework.
They aren't mutually exclusive.
Not at all. A song can be a calculated, highly profitable product designed for maximum relatable engagement, and it can be a profound, accurate expression of universal human suffering at the exact same time. The commercial intent doesn't invalidate the philosophical truth of the lyrics.
I love that duality. And it transitions perfectly into one of the most creative sections of the book, where the author stops analyzing them from a distance.
Oh, this part is amazing.
The author actually forces the pop star and the philosopher into the same physical space, bringing them face to face to hash out their differences directly. Let's talk about the Uber ride to nowhere.
It's an amazing piece of speculative fiction. The book sets the scene meticulously. A hypothetical 4.2-kilometer Uber ride in Nashville late at night.
The radio is off. The guitar case is resting in the back.
It's just Taylor Swift and Arthur Schopenhauer sitting next to each other in the back seat, watching the streetlights pass. The dialogue the author crafts here is incredibly sparse, almost like a play by Samuel Beckett. Every word carries weight.
Swift breaks the silence by observing him and saying, "You don't seem very optimistic."
And Schopenhauer, without missing a beat, replies, "That is because I am paying attention."
It's the quintessential Schopenhauer posture. Optimism, to him, is merely a failure to observe reality accurately.
Swift defends herself, saying she writes songs about love. Schopenhauer immediately corrects her. You write songs about lack.
They get into the actual mechanics of her songwriting. Swift says, almost defensively, "He doesn't even know how I feel."
And Schopenhauer echoes the entire thesis of the book back to her. That is precisely why you feel it so strongly.
Swift calls that dynamic cruel. And Schopenhauer simply shrugs and says reality often is. He then dismisses the entire concept of romance, calling love nothing more than a strategy of the species to trick individuals into reproducing.
And continuing the cycle of suffering.
Which is such a cold, biological way to view a crush. But then they turn to the song itself. Swift says, "I put teardrops on my guitar." And Schopenhauer identifies exactly what she's doing in his philosophical framework.
Yes, you aestheticize suffering.
Swift bristles at that. She feels like he's calling her art a manipulation or a trick, but Schopenhauer clarifies his position.
He says, it is a remedy for wanting what you cannot have. He is validating her life's work within his own deeply pessimistic system. He's acknowledging that she has found the loophole.
But the Uber ride has to end. They arrive at the destination, and this is where the grand ultimatum happens. Swift looks at him and asks if there is truly no solution to all this endless wanting and suffering.
Schopenhauer gives his ultimate ascetic answer, stop wanting.
Which reflects his deep engagement with Eastern philosophy, right?
Yes, particularly the Upanishads. He believed the only true escape was to extinguish the will entirely, a kind of nirvana achieved through ascetic renunciation.
But Swift delivers the ultimate pragmatist's reply. She looks at him and says, "That won't sell records."
To which Schopenhauer nods and concludes, then at least you will suffer beautifully.
It's a stunning ending. It's amazing how this tiny dialogue perfectly encapsulates the tension between Eastern-influenced asceticism, the idea of giving up desire, and Western romanticism, feeling it as deeply as possible.
It is the ultimate standoff between renunciation and expression. The philosopher chooses silence, the artist chooses the stadium.
So we've decoded the lyrics. We've unpacked the 19th century philosophy. We've even ridden in an Uber with them.
We've covered a lot.
But there is a massive lingering question hanging over this entire deep dive. We haven't answered why the author, this mysterious mouse-colored cat, wrote this incredibly bizarre book in the year 2026.
To understand the why, we have to turn to the afterword. It is titled Antidote to Algorithmic Inbreeding, and it completely shifts the context of everything we've just discussed.
This is where the book takes a sharp, unexpected turn away from metaphysics and directly into the present day. We're talking about digital autophagy and the human rebellion.
The author makes a startling admission. They explicitly state that a book like this, synthesizing pop lyrics, 19th century German pessimism, international legal doctrines, and behavioral psychology, would have been materially impossible to assemble without the use of large language models.
They are openly admitting to using artificial intelligence, but they aren't singing its praises, are they?
Not at all. The author refers to these AI models with a deeply critical phrase. They call them stochastic parrots of infinity that read everything and understand nothing.
That is a scathing description. But let's unpack why the author is so worried about them.
The author draws a fascinating historical parallel. They note that when digital image processing first emerged, like early JPEGs in the late 1980s and 90s, the massive revolutionary promise was zero generation loss.
Meaning what exactly?
If you made a copy of a VHS tape, the copy was fuzzier. If you copied the copy, it was unwatchable, the signal degraded. But a digital copy is a mathematically perfect clone. The fidelity is infinite.
Exactly. But the author argues that today, with generative AI producing massive amounts of text, ideas, and art, the danger is completely inverted.
Yes. We no longer fear the degradation of the signal. The AI's grammar is flawless. The formatting is perfect. What we are facing now is the degradation of meaning.
The author warns the more we generate, the less we create. And the book introduces a terrifying concept for this phenomenon, digital autophagy.
Autophagy is a biological term that essentially means self-devouring. To understand why this applies to AI, we need to look at how a large language model actually works.
Okay, lay it out.
At its core, an LLM is a prediction engine. It looks at a string of words and uses vast mathematical probability distributions to predict what the most likely next word, or token, should be based on its training data.
So it's mathematically biased toward the average. It looks for the most common, statistically probable connection between ideas.
Yes. And as these AI systems generate millions of articles, essays, and scripts, they flood the internet with this mathematically average, highly probable text. Then, the next generation of AI models comes along and scrapes the internet for training data.
Oh, I see where this is going.
They end up ingesting the output of the previous AI. They are feeding on their own outputs.
That is the self-devouring loop, the autophagy.
And within that recursive loop, thought physically flattens. Because the AI is predicting the most likely next token, it inherently shaves off the statistical outliers. The weird, unpredictable, deeply human leaps of logic.
With every single iteration of this feedback loop, the text becomes smoother, safer, and more intensely average.
It produces conformity at a massive scale. It irons out all the friction of human thought.
That is a terrifying diagnosis. We're building a world of perfectly average thought generated infinitely. So what is the author's solution? If the machine is devouring itself, how do we stop it?
The author introduces a concept they call capacitivism. The argument is that we cannot retreat. We cannot simply smash the servers or refuse to use the digital photocopy. The solution is to intentionally overload the machine.
We have to inject chaos into the algorithm.
The author advocates for what they call intellectual vandalism. They point out that AI is exceptional at organizing information logically, but it cannot dare. It cannot make a conceptual leap across completely unrelated domains because those leaps are statistically improbable.
Therefore, it is the duty of the human to inject friction into the circuit.
We have to force the algorithm onto side roads it would never choose mathematically.
The book lists a few examples of this intellectual vandalism, and they are brilliant. The author talks about linking Taylor Swift's Red Scarf from the song All Too Well to Martin Heidegger's ontology.
which forces the machine to process the concept of Dassen Heidegger's theory of human existence and how physical objects hold the memory and weight of being through the lens of a pop culture artifact left in a drawer.
The author also mentions putting the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze in lipstick, connecting Niccolo Machiavelli's theories of ruthless political power to a getaway car.
Or exploring Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica in a stairwell.
Aquinas spent his life categorizing the infinite nature of God. And the author wants to force the machine to cross-reference that massive theological architecture with the fleeting, highly emotional memory of a romantic encounter in a stairwell.
Because there is simply no existing training data for Wittgenstein in a slammed door, by forcing these bizarre, statistically improbable pairings, you introduce sparks that the system cannot anticipate.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Is the author saying that our bizarre, unpredictable human ability to smash two unrelated things together, like a teen pop idol and a miserable 19th century German guy, is literally our best defense against being replaced by machines?
This raises an important question about the role of the data sovereign, or the citizen of tomorrow. Yes, that is exactly what they are saying.
Wow.
In the past, sovereignty was about possessing information. But today, the machines already possess all the information. True sovereignty now is about the ability to bend the flow of that information, to disturb its rigid logic, and to prove that a human mind is still operating the controls.
So the author has deliberately taken the color of the mouse to slip inside the machinery of the algorithm and misbehave creatively. That's why this book exists.
It is an artifact of intellectual vandalism. It is an object that the probability distributions of an LLM left to its own devices would never have dared to assemble.
It required the unpredictable spark of a human. Or, as the author playfully notes at the very end, maybe a human cat.
A human cat, exactly.
What an absolute roller coaster of an intellectual journey. We started by dismantling cultural snobbery through the sociology of a dinner party eye roll.
We definitely covered some ground today.
We waded into the delightfully gloomy 19th century biography of a poodle-owning philosopher who was convinced the universe was a hostile machine designed to make us miserable.
And we explored the deep, unyielding metaphysics of unrequited love.
Discovering that a teenage crush is actually a masterclass in the mechanisms of human desire. And finally, we arrived at the concept of intellectual vandalism as our last line of defense against an AI-generated future of perfectly average thoughts.
It is a staggering synthesis of ideas, really, taking the listener from the intimate pain of a spiral notebook to the existential threat of algorithmic conformity.
So, to everyone listening right now, I want you to consider your own unrequited desires. This doesn't just have to be about romantic heartbreak.
Think about a promotion you desperately want but keep getting passed over for.
Or think about a creative project that refuses to come together, or a life goal that always seems just slightly out of reach. Are you suffering because you actually lack that specific object? Or are you suffering simply because the will demands that you desire something to keep the machine running?
It is a deeply uncomfortable question to ask yourself.
It really is.
Yeah.
But maybe there's comfort in the loophole. The next time you find yourself stuck in a relentless loop of wanting something you cannot have, you don't necessarily need to read a 500-page philosophical treatise to find an escape.
No, you don't.
Maybe you just need to put on a sad song, step off the treadmill of desire, and become the observer for 3 minutes.
Suspend the suffering, just hit pause.
Exactly. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. The book playfully asks us to consider if Taylor Swift encoded philosophers into her songs intentionally, like she's leaving massive academic Easter eggs for the listener to find.
But consider the alternative.
All right, what if human experiences like grief, desire, and isolation are just so universally rigid that any honest attempt to write about them, whether it takes a 500-page academic treatise or a 3-minute pop bridge, will inevitably arrive at the exact same truth?
That maybe the X-ray of the human heart always shows the exact same jagged lines.
A powerful thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining me today on this deep dive. And to you listening, keep bending the flow of information and keep misbehaving creatively.